going to hand over to Noel, who is ready to talk about his wonderful new perennial plant directory. So over to you, Mr. Jazzy Shirt, Kingsbury.
Thank you, Annie. Annie
wrapped up.
Annie warmly wrapped up. Yes.
Cardigans galore. Yeah.
So yeah, my intention tonight was this would be the launch of the online Perennial Directory, which is something I've been thinking about for years, dangerously talking about for years, and then finally got down to doing about a year ago. Because we haven't sorted out the domains properly yet, and some things in the digital world do take an inordinate amount of time, so it's not actually launched, but it will be fairly soon. So what I wanted to do this evening was really to talk about all the thinking and the research that's gone on prior to my doing this. So I think the best thing is let's go straight to screen share. And I've long grumbled about the reference books we use or have to use. They tend to be very good on telling us how to grow plants well. They're not so good on the longer term, or what happens when you put plants together. This has actually long been a favourite of mine. Graham Stuart Thomas, who was the National National Gardens advisor for many years, was a fantastically knowledgeable character who wrote in this very kind of, we would consider it rather old-fashioned now, a really rather sort of aristocratic style. Some wonderful quotations in here, and this is one of the sort of first of the sort of new race of A to Z guides and perennials, and it is indeed packed full of information. But for those of us who are more interested in naturalistic or ecological planting, where plants are beginning to interact and compete with each other, this kind of basic information only goes so far. So I think this came out in 1994, certainly when I first got hold of it. And as you can see, my copy is very dog-eared with much use. Hansen and Stahl, Perennials and Their Garden Habitats, the English translation of a real German textbook. And that introduced a lot of us to a completely different way of thinking about plants. Instead of perennials, plants as these kind of individual items we sort of put together to make combinations, thinking very much more holistically, thinking about plant communities for different locations. So it's very much more about sort of a bigger scale of thinking, and owes very much to a long history in Germany of what's called plant sociology, a really quite advanced understanding of plants as growing in natural communities, a model which can be transferred to designed garden and landscape situations. First, 2000 to 2009, I was doing some planting design for Bristol City Council, traffic islands, roundabouts, these kind of locations which, unlike private gardens, are seen by hundreds, if not thousands of people per day. I'd much rather do this than work for some, kleptocratic financier who's only going to let a few of his equally wealthy friends in to see the garden he's paid for, or she has paid for. The downside, of course, is that city council maintenance of planting in Britain is sadly much diminished. So the real challenge here was to select plants that will be there very much for the long term, that can coexist reasonably happily, very much in the west of England climate, which is pretty wet and also very mild. And winters tend to offer a very, very long growing season, which of course is hugely friendly to weedy grasses and creeping buttercup and all those other things that survive, that continue to grow through the winter. And in Wales or Ireland or the west of England, we'll tell you all about. but this was it was an incredibly useful experience, and I was just sort of thinking about these concepts of trying to create plant communities, but really working with quite a limited range of things, and very, very much focusing on species that can will spread sideways, can elbow out competition. The buddleia right in the middle here was not planted by me, so a typical example of the kind of urban shrubby weed that tends to sort of pop up in plantings, but it was, actually perfectly compatible. So big reliance on geranium species, which do incredibly well in the west of the British Isles, because a lot of them are able to grow at low temperatures, which means they will leaf up really early, which is good competition for any weedy stuff coming up around that time. Alchemilla mollis, another great favourite. Acanthus, which again in urban areas tend to leaf up pretty early. Phlomis russelliana, which of course is usefully evergreen, fantastic plant, Phlomis russelliana. The perfect local authority roundabout plant, the sort of thing you can appreciate, hurtling around the roundabout at 50 miles an hour, and which looks good 365 days of the year. Quite a few Achillea in here as well. Some of those are quite short-lived, but I think we had some that kept going a reasonably long period of time. These plantings survived a remarkably long time. I mean, they're now sort of tending to be replaced. I'm glad to say they're being replaced with other perennial combinations. So I think Bristol City Council have perhaps got the good news at last, and indeed generally across Britain we are seeing more and more local government investing in perennials. Roundabouts and traffic islands, of course, occasionally get driven over, and it's good to have plants what I call self-repairing. Things like Euphorbia cyparissias, which are sending up underground runners, are very, very good at gap filling, the sort of thing that the tidy-minded more nervous gardener doesn't really like having in their garden, because they run around all over the place and you lose control over them. In situations where there is occasional physical damage, this sort of plant is actually really, really useful. And here, just to prove we are in the middle of Bristol, is some nice, carefully placed rubbish. Colleague the other day described a shrub as being the perfect thing for catching packets of crisps. We tried also with coppice planting, a Nigel Dunnett idea of using a few shrubs that can be coppiced, small trees and robust perennials that can take a sort of a fairly fierce cutback every winter. Somebody had done some guerrilla planting along here, sowing in the nigella, the love in the mist. And that's a nice thing about doing some of these plantings. Actually, you do something and then people start sort of adding to it. And if it's just scattering in a few packets of seed, that usually works quite well. Solidago rugosa, nice, well-behaved Solidago. Aster, little Carlo. I was working with a fairly limited number of very robust, reliable perennials, but which can make a really great splash in an urban area. So during this time, from 1996 until 2005, I had well, it was more than a weekend cottage, but we were living in Bristol, but also had this little place out in Herefordshire with a steeply sloping northeast facing garden, which was a great trial bed for again for densely packed perennials. And I was particularly pleased with here about how I managed to create a really quite dense plant community very quickly, and I think this got me very much thinking about, what do perennials do when you put them closer together than is conventional in border planting? What are the interactions? Do plants behave differently? And how much self-seeding can you allow? A lot of the blue-purple here is Geranium sylvestris, oh, it's a clone. Oh dear, I've forgotten the name of it now. It's one of the cultivars of Geranium sylvestris, which self-seeded but never ever became a problem. Like Aquilegia vulgaris, which you can also see here, it's got this very narrow profile. So it's not something that kind of sprawls out and competes, but sort of thing that can self-seed into relatively narrow gaps, perform fairly early in the season, and then not really be a problem. So that was an interesting lesson that there are certain plants that can actually build up to really quite considerable numbers, but not actually be that competitive, but also be incredibly decorative for some of the year. Now, it was when I was living here that I started or did most of the crucial work on my PhD thesis, which I will talk about a little bit later. We then in 2006 moved to Montpelier Cottage, or the cottage we called Montpelier Cottage in Herefordshire, which had, I think, 4 acres, house at the top of a slope. So you tended to sort of wheel things down to the bottom of the garden and they would never be wheeled back up again. But it was a nice slope. It was a sort of perfect slope for getting the sun. It was a fairly silty sandstone soil, so very quite moist and very fertile. So perfect conditions, in fact, for pretty aggressive weed growth. And again, it's that west of England mild winter climate. So a lot of this was creating plant combinations or all sorts of trial beds simply for evaluating perennials. We looked down on these fields, which we were part of the property, and which initially we had sheep in, and then after that we mowed on an annual basis, and were an interesting experiment in not meadow making exactly, but what you can do to sort of boost the number of wildflowers in a formerly pasture grassland. And we looked across to these oak woods, which was a rather nice view, very much a kind of private valley view. So May, early June was very much the best time of the garden, best time of year in that particular garden. So Aquilegia vulgaris here. This was a strain called Granny's Bonnet. So I originally got from Yelito, the wonderful German seed company. Really fantastic plants, quite short-lived, but continually self-seeding, and this incredible level of genetic diversity. And every year you were getting slightly different colors, slightly different flower shapes. It seemed to be the gift that kept on giving. Narrow profile plants that you can really let seed to a very high level, and which never then become a problem. And also just realizing that these were something that before put in a lot of their physiology was about growing fast early in the year, and June onwards they sort of became semi-dormant, which is quite a useful characteristic because it means you don't have to worry about them too much the rest of the year. They can essentially largely be hidden, be overwhelmed, in fact, by other later growing perennials, and without really that being having any negative impact on them. You'll also notice the cow parsley, Anthriscus sylvestris, which was a huge part of the local scenery. This again is something that starts to grow really very early, peaks by midsummer, and is essentially summer dormant. So again, something that is, although it can spread a lot, it is essentially uncompetitive. And what we used to do actually was to pull a lot of this out before it's seeded, so we're sort of limiting the amount it spread. But that very much introduced me to the idea that there are certain things you can let seed and you can manage them. And I think crucially for this, because it was so much a part of the local countryside, as part of the countryside of southern England and western England and Wales generally, it brings in that psychological, that subconscious link through to the natural landscape. So it worked very much with this garden as being somewhere that was segueing into a very beautiful rural landscape. So yeah, Anthriscus sylvestris, we've got Polemonium caeruleum, the Aquilegias. Quite a lot of the yellow in the background is actually creeping buttercup, which is a pretty strongly spreading weed in the wetter west of the British Isles, but quite low level. And one of those things that if you've got taller perennials, after a certain period, it really ceases to be a problem because it simply is being outcompeted by all your taller perennials. But a nice splash of yellow flowers early in the year. So once you've got a fairly established plant community, letting creeping buttercup go is no bad thing. It's a case of something that's a weed in one situation is not necessarily a weed in another. And I think that was again a very, very useful lesson to think about this whole gradient of what are weeds. On one end you've got things that are very, very aggressive and are problematic, and other things that are in most situations just perhaps a nuisance, and in other situations can be completely disregarded. So there's quite a bit of that weeping buttercup here, and geranium sylvestris, and yes, this is what I want to talk about. Trollius europaeus, this sort of pale yellow, the globe flower. Here on this moist soil, it was fantastic. We would get at least 2 months solid flower out of it, sort of April through to early June. Which in a drier garden elsewhere, no way would this perform so well. Herefordshire used to be more or less the sort of southernmost limit of globe flower in England. It's a species that does not regenerate at all well. So, agricultural intensification from the Victorian period onwards has really largely wiped it out. But there's just a few very small little nature reserves in Herefordshire where you can go and you can see globe flower in incredible quantities. And that's just an amazing thought that once so much of Herefordshire and other parts of lowland or central or northern England must have had globe flower populations. As the year got on, perennials get taller and wilder. Thalictrum ellin here was something I was quite keen on. The the highest level of what fluffy white flowers is Thalictrum ellin, one of several really tall Thalictrum varieties that are being produced, and very useful to have something so tall this early in the year. Normally we have to wait till sort of August, September before we get really tall perennials, but Thalictrum ellin will get up to this height really by the beginning of June. More self-seeding. This was the path between the house and a building we had built called the Pavilion, which was a straw clay building. I think we'll see a picture of it next, where I had my office. Nautia macedonica here, seeding. I think this is where I first realized that something sold as perennial was actually quite short-lived. But as you can see here, self-seeding considerably. So this again was a very useful lesson that there are perennials that seem to have a genetic trait towards being short-lived, and that set me off on a whole chain of research that I think was very important. That trying to draw attention to the fact that so-called perennials are not necessarily perennials, but exist on a gradient of longevity. And yeah, so this is looking the other way towards the Pavilion with Nautia macedonica and Geranium pratense seeding around. The yellow hypericum was simply a wildflower that introduced itself. We've got Salvia foscahauli as well, which is a nice leafy salvia, and again, quite a good self-seeder. As the year got on, the prairie stuff really dominated. A lot of us at this time were very interested in North American prairie. I was growing a lot of seed from North American origin, getting it going in the garden. I never really got the prairie planting to anything like what I wanted it. I think it would have taken actually a lot more plugs and a lot more plugs and a lot fewer slugs. We had one year in particular, a very, very, very wet year when the slug population was just unbelievable. I'd go out at night every evening, sort of doing June, July, and see how many I could squash. But they were really just did an incredible amount of damage, and I never really got the prairie successful beyond that. But yeah, a lot of us just love these really tall, late perennials. Helianthus lemon queen there to the left, a really successful cultivar. The pink is one of the Joe Pye weeds, probably Eupatorium purpureum. At the back, there's a very tall pale yellow pale yellow Helianthus. That's Helianthus Sheila's Sunshine, which was one. It's almost like a greeny, primrosy yellow, quite an unusual color for one of these late American daisies. I think that was when I got off Bob Brown, whose sister, I think at the time, was living in North Carolina, and I think there was a connection that Bob's trips to see his sister involved plants coming back. And Bob Brown's Cotswold Garden Flowers was at the time an enormously good source of really good perennials. Bob Brown has certainly got an amazing eye for a good plant. Pink is, I want to say Liatris. I don't think it is. No, I think it is. I think it is a Liatris. The white is Sanguisorba canadensis, a nice moisture-loving Sanguisorba. And the very tall pink is Eupatorium fistulosum, which is the tallest of that cluster of North American grassland eupatoriums. This is the one that this would grow up to 3.4 meters every year with hollow stems, which unfortunately made it particularly vulnerable to slug attack. But anyway, if it can escape the slugs, it gets up to 3.5 meters in this kind of real column, and surprisingly windproof. And when I was at the sort of latter stage of my being here, I very much got interested in looking at plant root systems, and so doing a lot of digging up plants and power washing the roots and photographing them. And I realized then that this does have an engineering trick. It has a whole series of radial roots that kind of radiate out from the central clump of rhizomes, which act as guy ropes. They're obviously taking the stress of wind, which gives it an established Joe Pye weed and incredible strength. The very tall asters and Helianthus don't have those roots, which means they're much more vulnerable to blowing over in the wind. Aster Munch, Rudbeckia fulgida, seeding fennel. I think this was the last year I allowed fennel to seed, realizing then that even when very small, fennel seedling has a really long taproot that's really hard to get out. So do be careful in letting fennel self-seed. Learning about the characteristics of the plants that self-sow in your garden is a very important lesson. And there it is with hollyhocks, which seeded remarkably well. I was always rather surprised at how well they seeded into what was actually quite a damp soil. And they are so amazing for summer, especially when you've got enough rainfall to keep them going, keep them looking good. Fantastic range of those really intense colours. And it's much to my sadness that here in Portugal now, I seem to be completely unable to grow them. End of the year, very much asters. I remember once being asked to do a lecture for Paul Picton's Old Court Nurseries with the National Aster Collection. It was their centenary, and I did my presentation for them, and I asked to be paid in asters. So I acquired a whole collection of New England asters and various others, including the one at the front, which is probably simplex and one of those terribly aggressively spreading ones, but not that was necessarily a problem. Eupatorium fistulosum again, lovely silhouette plant, lovely thing for growing against a dark background, especially as the growing season draws to a close. Aster, I was growing lot of what I grew here was grown from North American seed, either wild collected or seed I'd imported from various US seed suppliers in the good old days before completely unnecessary and idiotic regulation has really limited seed transfer between countries. We've got here Aster umbellatus, now Dole ringia umbellata. Generally, the daisy family, Asteraceae, seems to operate on the principle that they will only set viable seed if you've got two clones that can cross-pollinate, which means that for some of these, you can end up, if you grow them from seed, you end up with multiple clones. Therefore, you get very, very strong seeding to the point, certainly where this was becoming something of a nuisance. But if you just have the one cultivar, that is effectively sterile because it has no other clones locally that will pollinate it. That's actually quite an important lesson that if you are growing wild Asteraceae from seed, be prepared for the population to then very, very actively cross-pollinate and produce a lot of seed. Another aster that's seeded a lot, Aster puniceus, always in a way that was very welcoming, very welcome. This is not actually a rhizomatous aster. It forms a very, very tight clump. Seems to last for quite a few years. Seeds fairly strongly, but never too much. I originally found this, actually collected the seed from a little roadside swamp in the Catskills in New York State. And it was always one of my favorite plants, especially since no one else actually had it in cultivation, although it was in cultivation in at least until the 1920s in England. Nice purpley blue, flowers for quite a long time. And again, one of those things you could let self-seed and was never really too much of a problem. And if you did want to get rid of it, this very tight clump was actually quite easy to fork out. At the end of the year, it's very much whatever autumn color we can glean from perennials and seed heads. Now, I mentioned this garden as being very fertile soil, very moist. Grass growth was incredibly lush. And I would say the number one problem in managing the garden was the growth of unwanted weedy pasture grasses in amongst your perennials. The only way I was able to completely defeat this was in the research plot, which I'll show you in a little bit, where we started off with very dense planting. Anything else would get invaded by creeping buttercup and pasture grasses very quickly. The creeping buttercup, as I've mentioned, was not a long-term problem. Pasture grasses are in a climate like this where they've got a very long growing season, very problematic. These are plants whose photosynthetic optimum is below 10 Celsius. So they will grow very early and very strongly. It was something that was, cannot overemphasize. This was a huge management problem. A limited number of perennials could compete. Euphorbia palustris was one, Persicara bistorta, especially the more vigorous, probably tetraploid cultivar superbum was another. We had part of the garden which we called the wild garden, which started off as a kind of dumping ground for things I had too much of, didn't know what to do with, shove them in here. And it turned out actually to be one of the most successful parts of the garden. I suspect because all the stuff I was dumping was actually quite vigorous and therefore the most able to occupy space and defeat the local weeds. And in May and June, it was just absolutely wonderful. Lots of geraniums, lots of self-sown anthriscus, clumps of Iris sibirica, aquilita, aquilita, Thalictrum aquilita folium. The blue here is Symphytum caucasicum, an incredibly vigorous, strongly spreading perennial, which flowered for about 3 months. The noise of bumblebees around it was sometimes almost deafening. But an extraordinarily strong spreader on a fertile soil. And we actually used to have a meter-wide mown cordon sanitaire around it, simply just, that seemed to be the only way you can grow this plant without it completely taking over. So again, something to make you think about plant competitiveness. What I liked here was having these mown paths through really dense perennial planting, at times actually going through with strimmers or mowers, and just having planting so dense that it was almost approaching that of a wild plant community. That was always very much my sort of gold standard to which I was aiming. And as you see here with cow parsley and creeping buttercup, once a perennial planting with these robust perennials is established, you can let the wild stuff move in and not be too worried about it. Red campion, Silene doosea, very common short-lived wildflower in the west of the British Isles. Needed quite a bit of work to get it going, growing from seed, planting seedlings out, and then hoping that over time it'll self-seed. There's ligularis in there to flower later. Aster rivularis right at the very front with his young bronzy foliage. Something that will spread over quite long distances with very big, rather magnificent leaves. Euphorbia palustris began to self-seed after a while. This soil is probably very much approaching its wild habitat and moist meadows in mainland Europe. Various candelabra Asiatic primulas doing well on the moist soil. Thalictrums, Geranium sylvestris in various colors. It's nice. It's nice having things where you've got a color range. You've got a whole genetic diversity of several cultivars or something, then beginning to cross, and you're getting, all the different colors coming up. Much more interesting, I think, than working with single cultivars. Later in the year, and something else that again was very good at coming up in vigorous rough grass, Crocosmia lucifer, an incredibly vigorous plant that was able to really send up these narrow shoots. Like a lot of monocotyledons, combining stem and leaf is a sort of good engineering principle for sort of getting up through and making the most of light above other vigorous plants. The meadow we had was, part of it had an incredible wildflower and grass and sedge diversity. This is August. This is mostly Angelica sylvestris. But we had an incredible range of other flowers in there. And it would be very different, very, very different from one year to another. And over time, once we took the sheep out, the explosion in growth of common spotted orchid, Dactylaries fuchsii, was quite incredible. I mean, we had thousands of these things. They spread incredibly quickly after about 5 years after we stopped grazing, and a really wonderful sight. But I wanted to introduce various plants which I knew grow locally in similar habitat, damp meadows. So one year I grew a friend actually who had a somewhat richer wildflower community in Monmouthshire, gave me a load of seed, so we grew a load of seedlings, and I did a roundup strip, 1 meter wide, to kill off the existing vegetation, planted out the plugs, and then basically left it too. And we tried about half a dozen different species. Now, interestingly, far and away the most successful was the Trollius. So delighted to be able to reintroduce Trollius to the kind of meadow where probably in the distant past it may well have been native, and very much hope that it's still thriving there. More images. Yeah, just to emphasize dense planting. This is the kind of density of planting that I think makes for a really interesting, exciting planting where things are self-seeding and spreading and intermingling, and nothing is getting the upper hand. Crucially, management is about stopping one thing getting the other hand. Although, to be honest, as most of my work here was actually dealing with pasture grasses. Little mysteries like Campanula trachelium wasn't a local native plant. I never planted it. It appeared and gradually began to seed around. Lysomachia Lysomachia firecracker. Again, very dense planting. These strongly spreading, strongly rhizomatous plants tend to be much more restricted in growth and act much more as gap fillers. Right, I better move on. Hollyhocks. Yes, now we had two they weren't volunteers, two trainees through the Women's Farm and Garden Association. Our first successful one was a face now, I'm very glad to say, familiar to all viewers of BBC Gardener's World, Adderley Richmond, who came to us as a RAG trainee and was great fun to have around. And I'm delighted to say that she's now the garden history buff on Gardener's World. I like to think perhaps I played a part in that, because I said to her several times, Adderley, you should be on telly. You've got great presence. So our second really successful trainee was Diana Cesarego, who was with us. In fact, we ended up employing her. And she totally got what we were about, which was wonderful. So thank you very much, Diana. Towards the end of our stay there, we're increasingly welcoming tour parties. This was a Czech group. And we had workshops. And of course, we opened for the National Garden Scheme, the Yellow Book. Over, I think, about 3 years. You just pray the weather's going to be okay. You bang in notices around the neighborhood, and you make lots of cups of tea, and you get people in to make cakes and help sell them. And they were all terrific fun, even on the time it really chucked it down with rain. We had a really good turnout. They're a lot of work, but they're huge fun, and actually also a very good way of meeting people. We certainly made some interesting and valuable contacts through doing the Yellow Book. Now, I want to talk about the PhD, the research doctorate I did at Sheffield University, which I completed in 2007, I think it was. You do these things and you look back afterwards and you think, did I really do all of that? And what does that mean? And why did I do it? I think PhDs should be doubled up, because you don't really understand the subject or really know the questions to ask until you've actually finished. So when you've finished your PhD, that's actually the best time to start thinking about what you really want to do. Anyway, I was very much taken up with competitor stress CSR theory, as a lot of people were, and spent a lot of time with a photocopier, photocopying leaves, drying leaves in the oven, weighing them on a micro balance down, which has a tolerance of 1/100 of a gram. And I could go on about this quite a bit, but it really wasn't very helpful. I spent a lot of time measuring and estimating leaf canopy. I was convinced, and still am convinced, that one of the key factors in predicting plant performance is how effectively plants can cover the ground early in the year, especially in a long-growing season, weed-friendly climate like the west of the British Isles. So, this sort of stuff, one day I might come back to it, because I think it actually is quite useful, although extremely tedious to look at. And I was developing all these sort of measures, trying to sort of estimate, actually quantify, how effectively a perennial covers the ground at a particular time of year, and whether that is combined with canopy height or the number of shoots it sends out, and trying to sort of see all these correlations. And the charts got longer and longer and more complicated, and I am no good at statistics. I do look back at this now with a certain amount of horror, but also I think I did learn a lot. But what I failed to do was one thing I wanted to come out with was actually a sort of categorization of perennials, and in the end I just gave up, because it seemed to be a group of plants that were impossible to develop any meaningful categories for. So the most I could come up with are these grids. I mean, I like grids. I like putting an x-axis with one gradient against a y-axis with another gradient, and it can be a wonderful way of kind of sorting out and helping us develop a mental map of something that is, first of all, confusing. And this was, fairly successful, but, I did admit defeat on developing a coherent system of categorizing perennials. After I'd done my PhD, I was able to join a Sheffield University's contribution to, I don't know what they were called now, but it was a rather wonderful thing the European Union has for funding projects that are to do with the spending of public money. And so I developed this questionnaire, which was aimed to really try to elicit as much information from experienced gardeners on long-term plant performance. So I managed to get 66 people, most of them recruited through the Hardy Plant Society, who were filled in these questionnaires about plant longevity, spread, self-seeding, all this kind of long-term stuff that the books are not very good at telling you. And this was actually a very neat way of making sense of the PhD stuff. It didn't throw up anything new, but what it did was actually confirm an awful lot of what I'd suspected. So in a way, doing this was actually more valuable than doing my PhD, and it's certainly something I've referred to in my teaching and writing a lot more than anything I did in the PhD. And things like this were particularly useful. The longevity list, the bomb proof at the one end, and the buy it next to the till in the garden centre and watch it die over the next couple of years at the other. And those of you who have done any of my workshops will have seen extracts from this. Terrifically useful stuff. Speed of establishment and relating that to longevity. Again, teasing out stuff that's actually really very useful for practical garden people. Two, I'm not calling these research papers. They were not peer reviewed. I'm sure they would be shot down by any academic, but it was really nice to be able to share the results in the Hardy Plant Society Journal and in the Plant Review. Then in Briley in Herefordshire, I laid out a research plot the idea I'm just going to do this and I'm not going to completely survey until we leave. So 7 years later, we surveyed this plot. I'm not going to go into detail. I will be doing that at a webinar, I think, next year sometime. But great opportunity, putting perennials in really close together. We actually had 11 plants per square meter. And looking at the competition. And in that final year, when we decided to move, anyone who came to visit or any horticultural person who was staying in our B&B would get dragooned into doing a bit of surveying. So thank you, those volunteers. And I came up with a whole series of grids. It was a very easy thing to do this. It's just, what is growing in each one of these 10 centimetre squares. And then you can kind of whack it on an Excel spreadsheet and come up with something nice and colourful and visual, and you can very easily interpret this, especially when you do an overlay of where things were originally. And we can see the dark green is Phlomis russeliana, and we can see how that has spread, but we can also see how it has broken up. So I found this actually an extraordinarily useful bit of research to have done, to have had something there for 7 years, which is at least twice as long as anything ever gets done in an academic trial or indeed in RHS trials for whatever they're worth. He says dismissively, I just wish this is an easy thing to do. I wish more people would do this. It's good fun watching change over the year and documenting it, and then when it's all done, you can actually then to be able to map out and see over time how plants, mesh together and how they behave, whether they stay as nice clumps like the solidago here in the yellow, or kind of break up and move around. Really interesting stuff. So I managed to write that up in the plant review. And then I had my phase of digging plants up and really muddy business in the winter. You're doing this and there's sort of you're power washing this and there's kind of mud flying everywhere. And you've got to do so much washing to get all the mud off to photograph. And it's not easy to do. It's quite difficult to get the depth of field right. And very often it's brown against brown, but a useful exercise. And by this time, I was getting very interested in rhizomes and thinking, well, we can understand perennials through understanding their rhizomes. But then things like Euphorbia palustris threw me, a plant that is clearly long-lived, very robust, but is not rhizomatous. It just forms this sort of massive, great big taproot that after a few years is a really major effort to try and dig out of the ground. And I must admit, I never really faced up to the fact that I did not understand these. I didn't know how they fitted into my kind of system. Now, why was I saying this picture? I can't remember. Anyway, I came across this book on a very cold winter's day in Boston's Arnold Arboretum Library, and I'd heard about it, looked at it, and was delighted to see the author had photographs of plant root systems, which you very, very rarely see. And I read the introduction, and he referenced a Polish research worker, Alexander Łukasiewicz. As luck would have it, my dear friend Małgosia Kijinska, within, I think, a matter of weeks, had got hold of this, which was Łukasiewicz' 1962 doctoral thesis. And later that year, we spent some time looking at this. And here was a system for categorizing perennials that is the best kind of science, just really elegant, simple, evidence-based strategy. And so here at last was, if I'd only known about this when I'd started my PhD. That's the other thing about, the literature review of research. You are very often limited by language. And here it is. I'm not going to even attempt to explain it. That will come later in a webinar. But this is his way of classifying perennials, which to me makes complete sense. And like any good biological science, actually fits in with evolution. You can see how the process of evolution it works with this. All supported by these wonderful drawings, which were done by a lady who had been Poland's leading surrealist photographer before turning to the rather more remunerative field of botanical art. Fortunata Obropalska, and indeed, I think it was 2018, we were able to go to Poznan Botanical Gardens and see this incredible archive of root drawings, which unfortunately we've not been able to sort of get much cooperation in terms of reproduction. So this last year, I was very glad to be able to make the acquaintance of the daughter of some friends of ours here in Portugal who have a small nursery, and who's a really wonderful self-taught botanical artist. So I now have Una Scherer doing drawings for me. Una's just started a apprenticeship in Hamburg Botanical Gardens. So at some point I shall turn up there with my spade and hopefully, you never know, we might be able to get some more drawings done. But meeting Una has been quite amazing. I mean, the accuracy with which she can render a really complex root system is quite extraordinary. And of course, you get a level of detail you will never get in photographs. So the Rabbit's Eye View, my sort of whimsical title for the workshop, which I've run many times, presenting this research. It's really, really important to get research out there. This is the ideal situation where all members are on their hands and knees, getting that rabbit's eye view. What goes on where shoots meets roots, what goes on at ground level is incredibly important in understanding. You can do it to a certain extent desk-based as well. Here we are in the University of Sheffield, looking at reasonably well cleaned perennials in a lab session, or with landscape architects who, as you can see, are not so keen on getting on hands and knees, or perhaps not very comfortable kneeling down on concrete. I don't know. Anyway, we are landscape architects getting to nitty gritty with perennials, and here we are in Moscow, running a course for the Eco Landscape Seminary. I won't go into that. A lot of this was trying to really introduce new concepts in order to really understand how plants grow. We sometimes need to develop concepts which may not be strictly botanically correct or accurate, but which are very developing like a language for understanding plant growth, which then enables us to communicate that and therefore to share information. Which we have some wonderful A to Zs, but what I wanted to do was to do something that was really incorporating what I had learned about long-term plant performance over the years, as well as incorporate all of the Łukasiewicz research on root and rhizome systems, and hence the soon-to-be launched Perennial Manual. And I've borrowed dear Graham Stuart Thomas's 20 Modern Philologium in the subtitle, because I think that was a wonderful book worth remembering. So we've got various discussions in there, a lot of which is about what I've been doing in workshops over the years, really trying to get to grips with encouraging people to look at how plants grow, but also how they grow over time, and how they grow in nature, and how we can relate that to garden and landscape situation. And then this is a typical entry. We've got, I think, a lot more information here than you'll find in any of the A to Z books on, how plants spread over the time, what to help us to sort of get some idea of thinking, well, what is this going to look like in 5 years' time or 10 years' time? And the idea of this is something that it can be continually updated. It is also potentially collaborative, and very keen to get other people involved. It's not always easy, but every now and again you meet somebody who is really keen on collaborating. And I'm also hoping to extend this beyond perennials. I'd like to move on to grasses and subshrubs eventually. Potentially this is a really long-lived and potentially a very useful resource, which it'll be online free for a bit, and then there will be, we haven't worked out the business model yet, but it'll be basically accessible on a subscription basis, with a nice fat discount for members of Garden Masterclass. Surprise, surprise. Anyway, that's a lot of what I've been keeping me off the streets for the last year or so, and I'm very much looking forward to sharing it with you. And I've also been trying to, where we've got Jenna with a large number of cultivars, mostly focusing on AGM cultivars, which is a good starting point. I mean, the RHS trials process is, I think, flawed, but the AGM, the whole concept of the AGM is a really good one, and it's a really good way of focusing in on plants that are worth looking at and tabulating their criteria. Well, that's Virginia, by the way. So I hope to get that launched in the next few weeks, and we'll then be doing some publicity about it, and I hope that you will find it useful. And I hope that has been interesting. But it's been my sort of intellectual journey over the last 20 years or so, and it's been nice to share it with you.
Noel, was the blue geranium Mrs. Kendall Clark by any chance?
No, that's a Pratense. This is a Geranium sylvestre Mayflower.
Right.
Mayflower.
Okay.
It's either Mayflower or birch lilac.
Okay.
Mayflower. I think it's Mayflower, but it seemed to seed pretty consistently. I mean, it seemed to seed pretty true, and a really delightful plant.
Good. There's a few questions. How do you deal with hollyhock rust?
Well, we were quite lucky. We never really had much of it. I think kind of the further west you go, the less there is blowing in on the wind. And also, if you've got fairly high summer moisture levels, the plants stay healthier. I think if this plant is stressed, it'll then be much more vulnerable to any fungal disease. It was never really a problem for us. And when we were living there, I don't think we ever had a dry summer. We had some that were, ridiculously wet.
Mm,
Uh, so I think that's probably the answer.
right.
Uh,
Um,
holly,
and
Hollyhocks in the Victorian era are a really, really big thing. And people were doing cultivars. You could buy all these cultivars, all these different colours. Then
mm,
hollyhock rust arrived. Don't know where it came from. It's like box
mm.
blight, and all the other box diseases. It suddenly arrived, and almost overnight, hollyhocks became something you would grow as a biennial from seed.
In fact, I think it was a good year for them this year. In fact, at
Yeah,
Charleston, the hollyhocks were stupendous.
really, really.
Well, you were dwarfed by them. They were incredible.
Yeah,
But
wow.
I think possibly it was a very wet spring and early
Yeah,
summer, so maybe
yes,
that's the
yes, yeah,
answer.
yeah, yeah.
Rachel's asking, what does CSR stand for?
Competitor stress tolerant ruderal. It was a theory of ecology that was thought up in the 1980s by a chap called J. Philip Grime, who was a researcher at the University of Sheffield. It was controversial for a bit, but it's been very largely accepted. I mean, it's a very powerful theory for explaining why plant species grow the way they do and how they fit together in communities. Um, it can be applied to animals, it can be applied to various other ways. And quite a lot of people in Germany have, like Cassian Schmidt, have found it very useful as a way of thinking about how you organize plants,
Mhm.
really matching it to maintenance needs.
Right. And lots of thank yous, and oh, this is going to be very useful, and I think it really is. And we should just mention again that next week the naturalistic planting design course starts, and we're going to only run one per year. So if you're hesitating about it, you maybe don't hesitate. Maybe now's the time to do it. And the other thing we forgot to mention at the start of the program was the podcast. We've got into podcasts a bit late to the party, but that's fine. So to find our podcasts, you can either go via Substack, which is the platform that we're using, or just go to our website and follow the links through. But we've uploaded quite a few already, so yeah. So watch this space, really.
Uh,
Okay.
no, Lorenza, I haven't included Mediterranean plants. I'm sort of getting to grips with them. At some point, that would be really good. But Mediterranean plants, you're very much talking about subshrubs, which, again, one of those things that defy categorization. But no, eventually, one day, perhaps you'll have.
And look at the sun streaming into your office.
I know, yes, the sun is just
How
about.
jealous are we when it's actually dark here already. So
You're not jealous in the middle of August when it's kind of beating down on you.
okie doke. All right, that's great, Noel. Well, it's gonna be
Thanks,
great.
Rennie.
It's gonna be a really good thing, isn't it? It's gonna be a great resource, and
Yes, yes, I
what
hope
a lot
so.
of work has gone into
Yes,
it.
yes, yes. Then we
Mm.
must talk about the business plan for it.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah,
Get down to
yeah,
business. All right.
yeah.
Well, thanks everybody who's tuned
Well,
in
thanks for
tonight,
coming in. Yeah,
and we'll see you next week at 6 o'clock
you
when
too.
we
Yeah, yeah.
Ethan Kaufman from Stoneleigh in
Yeah,
America.
look forward to
All
that.
right.
Bye,
Okay. Bye,
bye,
everyone.
bye.
Bye.